When I was little and dreaming about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I wasn't exactly like the other kids. The normal things, I want to be a fireman, a policeman, a teacher, a lawyer, doctor, sports figure, something like that. I didn't dream of those things. I dreamed of growing up and becoming a comedian. From age like maybe 6 on. On career day, when you dressed up like the fireman or whatever, I actually wore goofy shoes and a big fat hat, like a big fat tie, you know, like a comedian might. That's all I knew the comedians wore. But I dreamed of being a comedian, so much so that I would actually go rent, 10 years old, rent videos of old comedians and do my best to memorize them and then perform them for my family, in which they were very kind to laugh at anything. Really, this is just kind of a long way of saying I wasn't the cool kid in class, is what I'm trying to tell you. But I can tell you this, my favorite comedian was Bill Cosby. He was, in my opinion, the godfather of comedy. He was, you know, the last great American storyteller. He was comedy. Now, knowing this, my wonderful wife, just a few years ago, bought me for my birthday tickets to see Bill Cosby in what will probably end up being his last sort of comedy tour. And so I got to see the Godfather, and I'll never forget. He walks in, and the stage is a huge auditorium, and the stage is set up like a living room. Like there's a rug and an easy chair and a little TV stand next to it. And he walks out, and Grace West just kind of waddles out. He's done it 7,000 times before. He sat down in the easy chair, and he took the mic. He leaned forward and said, "I'm 72 years old. And I grew up in an era back when young girls had fathers." That was his first line. And I remember it was like everybody kind of punched everybody in the audience at the same time, because that's not a funny line. That's more of a pretty heavy social commentary about, you know, dads not sticking around, about kind of what we've maybe done with our families. And I remember everybody kind of wondered as he's getting, because there's actually been rumors that he's had some the beginnings of Alzheimer's and some pretty sad stories, and people thought, gosh, I wonder if he's kind of losing his touch. And from that comment, he launched into some stories which were kind of affiliated with that opening statement, you know, and it sort of made sense, and we thought, well, I guess he's... But as he told the stories, and as he got into his groove, it was the same old Bill Cosby, and we got lost in his stories, and they were hilarious, and we laughed, and about the time we had forgotten that awkward beginning, how he had started, out of nowhere, he leans back and says, "And that's just what it was like growing up in a time when girls had fathers." Bam! He had made it come full circle. It was brilliant. He's a comedian. It's what comedians do. They make this little comment, and then you forget about it, and then 30 minutes later they bring it around, and you figure out that they had this thread going through every single story. It was brilliant. I've never seen anything like it. I've studied these people since I was 6, because I was a dork. I don't want to associate Bill Cosby with the Old Testament too much. I think there might be some theological problems there. But I would like to say that the Old Testament is the last great storyteller. It does exactly this. Time and time again, the Old Testament does this magnificent job of just flippantly mentioning this name, or this place, or this event, and there's no real reason for it, and then 40 chapters later, BAM! I don't know why you, again, I'm sorry. I got excited. And you find out why he included that name, or that story, or that event. Here's the deal. This story in 2 Samuel is right in the middle of one of those sequences. So while we get a little snippet of what's going on in David's world, what we need to do is step back and find this grander story that the Old Testament is telling us, because I think if we look closely, there's a thread to be noticed. So if you would, let's start by looking, we'll do an overview of the 2 Samuel story, and then I'll look at 2 others and see what we can find. Sound all right? Okay. Here's kind of the overview. First of all, David's in trouble. And I couldn't have Kate read for 20 minutes, so I just had to kind of pick a little section. But David's in trouble, and what David has done prior to this little section is he's decided to take a census. Now, there is no sort of overt statement in Old Testament law that taking a census is sinful or evil or wrong. However, everything in this story seems to kind of hint at, and every sort of rabbi since then has sort of understood this to say, as David got older proud of what he had accumulated. And this statement of taking a census, primarily of fighting men, was really a way of saying, let's sit back and see just how strong and how tough my army is. Let's see just how much of this world I can conquer. There was a statement being made about taking a census, which explains his guilt, which explains the reluctance of Joab, his sort of chief commander, to do this, and which explains the curse that comes immediately after. So, as we said, he feels guilty, and he has a seer, sort of his head prophet named Gad, and David says, God, please forgive me, please, I'm so sorry, and Gad comes with a message from God and says, essentially, you have 3 choices as your punishment for what you've done. And then, one's really long, and one's a little bit shorter, but they increase in terms of intensity, and David goes with the short one. All right? And it involves a plague of sorts to come over the people. And this plague comes along, and David feels even more guilty because people are dying because of his sin, and he goes back to God saying, please, please, please stop. Gad talks to God again and comes back and says, all right, here's what you got to do. You need, by the way, there was an angel, this is an interesting story. There's an angel of the Lord that came over the land, and it said this angel stopped. When David prayed and said, please stop, it says the angel sort of froze, right where the angel was, over the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Okay? And a threshing floor, just for those who aren't in the wheat business, ancient wheat business on top of that, it's essentially a place they would thresh the wheat from the chaff, okay? And then it was this big open field, or like open area. It would be a hard ground, and they would toss the wheat up in the air, and if it was where there was wind, the wind would carry away the chaff, and what would be left is what they ate, okay? So that's this big circular threshing floor kind of idea, okay? And David says, okay, and he goes to this place to make a sacrifice. And you see this scene with this faithful, loving Araunah the Jebusite sees David and says, King, take whatever you want. We love you. Oh, you need to make an altar? That's great. Use my wood, use my tools, use my bowl. That's great. And David says this really interesting line. No, 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 no. I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. Here's the deal. There's no rule that says that has to be the case. In the instruction manual that Gad gave, there was no rule on who needed to provide the bull or the tools or the wood or anything like that. They just said make a sacrifice. But strangely, built into David's DNA was this understanding that with an offering, there had to be a cost. That giving something to God actually had to sting a little bit. And to me, that's a little bit strange. And I thought, where would David get such an idea? That to offer something to God had to sting a little bit. Well, let's step back, okay? Step back just a little bit to a Genesis story. Several generations prior. It's a Genesis story that a lot of us are probably familiar with. It's Genesis 22. Might be my favorite chapter in the Bible, even though it's really problematic and sometimes difficult to understand. There's just something about it that I think is interesting. But this is a story where God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Are you familiar with it? And it's really interesting. There's been a lot of work done on just these first few lines when God talks to Abraham, because I think we need to understand just sort of how painful the sequence is. Usually, the Old Testament narrative would sort of drive the story on, and then this happened, and then so and so said, and then we did this, and then they did this, and it drives forward. But in this story, everything stops, and the language gets kind of weird. It gets really slow, and what some scholars will say is it's supposed to hurt. Like a knife twisting, it's supposed to hurt when you hear God say, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. It's not supposed to be a comfortable scripture. As a matter of fact, it reads so awkwardly that the ancient rabbis who used to sort of toy with Scripture and try to figure out the gaps, it was called midrash, they wrote what they thought was going on here. And what they believed was going on here was all we get is God's side of a conversation. And really God is talking to Abraham. And Abraham is sort of sheepishly answering back, trying to get around it. As they wrote it, as they understood it, God said, take your son. Now remember that Abraham had 2 sons. One was Ishmael through their maidservant Hagar. And so God said, take your son. And Abraham said, but I have 2 sons. God said, your only son. Abraham said, well, each is an only son to his mother. God said, whom you love. Abraham replied, I love them both. And God said, Isaac. And take him to Moriah and sacrifice him there. And that's where the conversation ended. Whether that be true or not, it points out just how painful this conversation was intended to be read. And if we jump ahead in the story, what we find out is Abraham and Isaac and a servant, they travel 3 days to a region called Moriah. And Abraham tells his servant, this is the interesting line in this passage, he says, wait here, the boy and I will go there, we will worship and return to you. Now here's the deal, there's a lot of ways that I might describe sacrificing my own son, but worship is not on the top 500 list. And the story goes on, and God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son. God provides a ram, and he sacrificed the ram instead. And we get a beautiful story, one that we'll probably actually study in just a few weeks, a little more, as it connects to John. That's not today. What is important is that in the process, we get the beginning of a really strange tradition. One that somehow makes sacrifice and worship almost synonymous. And it's a tradition that we can still see generations later in David's story. And this is interesting considering exactly how we use the term worship today. Because first of all, I would argue that probably worship by and large refers to right now. What's going on Sunday mornings, about an hour. You get emails if it's much longer than that. But that's worship. That's what we call worship. And then, on top of that, if hypothetically, and obviously this would never happen here, but hypothetically, let's say the sermon was especially pitiful one particular Sunday, or let's say that the piano had fallen out of tune a little bit, everything was just a little off key, or let's say that, maybe the pastor took an embarrassingly large chunk of bread for communion and had trouble finishing the liturgy, something hypothetical like that. We would say something like, well, worship wasn't very good this week. Yeah, worship was kind of strong. And that's the terminology we would use for worship. This isn't the definition we see from the ancient Hebrews. Worship seemed to have something to do with offering something dear. It seemed to be examining the parts of our lives that we would never consider examining because, gosh, we just really love those parts of our lives, so let's leave them there. That's what worship seemed to be wrapped up in. Okay, that said, we've got a quick pop quiz. So far we looked at 2 stories, and I just want to check in. Let's say the first story, who remembers, by any crazy chance, where David was asked to make that offering? Do you remember whose it was or what it was called? Oh, I'm so proud of you right now. You were that kid in Sunday school, weren't you? No, don't lie. I was wanting to be that kid. Araunah the Jebusite. Araunah the Jebusite. Flippantly mentioned, here's this guy, and he's the one that owns the land. The important thing is the sacrifice and all that. Okay? Now back to the Abraham and Isaac sacrifice thing. Where were they told to go do this? Be proud. Be brave.
Moriah.
What was it?
Moriah.
Moriah, the region of Moriah. On a mountain, I will tell you there. Those are the 2 things that have been listed so far. Let's flip forward for just a second. I just want to read you one verse. It's in 2 Chronicles. It's the beginning of the story about a man named Solomon, the king who was David's son. Okay? And Solomon was known for building the temple. That was sort of his great legacy. That and wisdom. Those were the 2 things that we always talk about Solomon for. Let me read you 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. He was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. Bam! Full circle. It's brilliant. It's perfect storytelling. We find out why we were mentioning all these places. We find out the history of the temple. In my Bible, these stories span about 400 pages. But it's as if where people offered something to God that was difficult, where they offered something that stung, that part of their life that they maybe least wanted to offer, in that place, God chose to build something magnificent. As a matter of fact, God chose to build a symbol of where God existed throughout the Old Testament. In the place where we offered that which was most difficult for us to offer, God chose to build something magnificent. So what does this mean for us? Because if we're not careful, I remember doing this sort of a Bible study with 9th grade boys, and I thought I had made this brilliant point, and I was like, okay, I'm looking for feedback, and one of them said, oh, so like, pain is worship. No, it's not quite what I meant. Not quite. Because I don't think we need a generation of Christian pain seekers. I think that would be missing the point. Pain is not innately good. Matter of fact, we typically try to avoid it, and rightfully so. But maybe in these stories we could begin to see all the ways that we've created a tradition of Christian pleasure seekers. A faith where we can never consider offering to God those parts of our lives that we really like. The fact is, we are Christians. We carry the name of Christ. And pretty central to the life of Christ and what Christ had to offer us, right in the middle of his story, was sacrifice, was a giving of himself. And if we're going to say we're trying to look like that, maybe we take a step back and say, what are the parts of our lives that we leave unexamined that we would never, ever offer? Maybe we should follow the example of Christ and start offering the things we would never touch for the sake of others. Because it is our namesake. Just actually yesterday I was talking to Matt and Sarah Harris, who I can't find you, Matt, Sarah, Matt and Sarah Harris, who have chosen, and they're quick to say, this is not everybody's choice, this is not some biblical rule, but they personally have said, gosh, we've learned a lot about how meat in America is sort of raised and how it's produced, and we just feel like for us, the faithful thing is to not do meat. We've chosen to be, and they love meat, mind you, like I love meat, but have chosen to be vegetarians because for them, they feel like that's a way to sort of act out their faith. And again, they're quick to say nobody else is going to hell for eating a burger. They don't think that. But they do think for them and what they've sort of figured out so far, what they eat matters. That was revolutionary for me because down to what we, this is a 3 times or 8 times, depending on who you are, a day process. I never consider what I eat as being an opportunity for sacrifice or something faithful or really a place to invite my faith. We don't do that. It's just our meal. But in the process of examining everything, what they did was find a way to worship, even if it meant giving up something they love. So maybe we do the same. Maybe we step back. Maybe we examine everything, even the things we don't really want to sacrifice. And in so doing, may God build on that place